The Colchester Sexual Assault Centre is thrilled to welcome our special guest presenter for today's session. So today we will be focusing on the LGBTQIA plus community, and sharing that perspective with us today is going to be Shannon Hardy, who is a registered social worker and works closely with the queer and trans community that we'll be discussing today. So Shannon is a queer social worker based out of Halifax here in Nova Scotia, but wears a number of hats, including content specialist in trauma-informed practices and approaches. She's also a workshop facilitator and a practicing therapist as well. She is also the founder and education coordinator of Abortion Support Services Atlantic. Shannon works with a variety of organizations across Canada, from small community groups to universities and law firms, helping them to create and implement trauma-informed practices and approaches in a meaningful and effective way. Her therapeutic practice is focused on reproductive and sexualized trauma, but also includes work surrounding polyamory, gender-affirming care, coming out, and navigating relationships. Shannon has been working in the field of sexual and reproductive wellness for over 16 years and was the recipient of the 2020 Sexcellence Award for her work in sexual and reproductive justice. So I will now hand it over to Shannon to get us going.
All right. Thanks, Jamie. Okay. So I know Jamie did my bio, but just to situate myself in a more organic way. So this is me. Actually, so I know I wrote 16. I think that was in October. Coming up on 17, I realized as I was making the slides. I am a white settler. I was raised in an Indigenous family. My entire family is Indigenous except for me and my mom. So I only tell you that because it doesn't have any bearing on our talk today, but it just helps situate me in a different way, right? I do identify as queer. I am cisgendered, and I'm married with 2 sons. Jamie also touched on this. This can be a hard subject. And even if you're a professional, even if this is what you do, it can be hard. So please tend to yourself. If you feel overwhelmed, if it's too much, if it's rubbing up against your own stuff, just take a break. It's going to be recorded. You can come back and watch it, but just tend to your needs. Okay? You can always send me an email. We can talk about it. Or go for coffee if you're in the city. I love coffee. Okay. So section 1, disrupting the narrative, right? Because we know that sexualized violence tends to be seen through a certain lens. Okay? And that lens is generally cisgendered, heterosexual, patriarchy, right? There's a cis woman, although it's usually just woman, it's, from their point of view, and a cis man, there's usually a penis and a vagina, right? That's what sexualized violence usually looks like through this lens. Right? And so when we're learning this at school or learning it in our jobs or in society, we don't, unless you're a member of a different community, that's how you tend to see it, right? Through this very heterosexual cisgender lens. But we know that that's not always the case. If you're a member of the LGBTQIA plus community, that's not the case, right? But we also know that sexual violence is perceived differently. So if you go into an emergency room, or you go to your doctor or a healthcare professional or to the police, sexual violence outside of that heteronormative gaze is perceived differently. And I've put in some citations at the end of this section, just for you to, if you want to look at the data behind that. And if anybody has any questions, we can certainly talk about that. So the first sort of barrier that comes up when we talk about sexualized violence in the queer community is that sexual violence exists within this male patriarchal heteronormative gaze. Right? And what does that mean? It means that the doctors or the healthcare professionals or the police services that you go to won't always know how to handle what you're telling them, right? They won't understand that maybe you're in a polyamorous relationship, not that that changes the sexual violence, but they may have to talk about things differently. They may not understand different gender expressions or pronouns. So sexual violence isn't as straightforward for people who don't live in that heteronormative community. Right? And of course, our community is not a monolith. We are not all one thing. Oh, you're lesbian, so you're this thing, you know, or you're queer, and that means the same thing to everybody. That's not true. We know that, right? So we need healthcare providers and law enforcement to understand, to have a sense of cultural competency, but we know that's not the case. So that's another barrier for people who've experienced sexual violence, but aren't a member of the heteronormative culture, right? And when I say cultural competency, I don't mean these people, these professionals are going to know everything about every section of our community. Cultural competency is flexibility in your practice. So not seeing things through your gaze. If your gaze is heteronormative, you have the flexibility in practice to see things differently. Right? But of course, that's not always the case. Okay. So that's our first section, right? Here are just a few of the citations that I thought would be helpful. The top one is through the Australian universities. They did the study. It won't, my guess is if you're on this call, it probably won't surprise you what they found in these studies, but it does give us a lot of conversation when we're building policies ourselves, right? These heteronormative assumptions and expectations, and what that actually means for people who don't live in that community, right? The second one here, it's actually an audiologist who wrote this paper, S. Jones, and talks about cultural competence. It is awesome. And so it's not about sexualized violence, but it is really well written. And if you want to have a conversation about cultural competence, he did a really good job to start that conversation. So I put it here. And then I will say this, the last one is a tough read. Right? So if you're wanting to read it, please do. I'm just letting you know it can be graphic. And we'll talk more about this idea of heteronormativity as violence. Okay. So let's move on to section 2. Intersectional trauma. One sec. So first, let's talk about intersectionality. All right. So intersectionality was a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. She's I believe she's at Stanford now, but she coined it in 1989. This is actually a quote from 2020, right? So this idea of intersectionality being a lens, how we see different inequalities, right? So this importance of knowing nobody walks in as one thing. Nobody is walking in as just somebody who's experienced sexual violence, right? There are other oppressions that are layered or intersected, a little on the nose, right? But understanding that people come with different layers. So that's intersectionality. And so we know these are some of the intersections in our community, in the LGBTQIA plus community, right? More likely to have housing insecurity, more likely to experience sexualized violence in childhood and in adulthood, be estranged from our family, death by suicide, mental and physical health issues. All of these intersections show up, right? And so there are times when we want to reach out for help, but we know these intersections won't be understood, right? Shame. Right? So shame is different than guilt. Guilt is, I did something wrong and I feel bad about that, right? Shame is, I am wrong. There is something wrong with me. That's shame, right? And when our identity seems like the barrier, right? My gender expression is the barrier. My polyamorous lifestyle is the barrier. Then we start thinking it must be me versus the system isn't made for me. Right? So another of those intersectional traumas, shame being the barrier for getting the help we need after sexualized violence or the support we need. And then learning this lesson, learning the lesson that taking up space isn't welcome. We're too loud, we're too much. It's outside of the norm, outside of the hetero norm. And so we aren't allowed to take up space. And in a world that isn't built for you, these stressors become trauma wounds, right? So a stressor. So for somebody who is heterosexual, cisgender, the world is made up for them, right? They don't have to pass. They don't have to pretend to be something else. They don't have to tone themselves down, right? All of the intake forms are created for them. All of the language in the hospital is created for them, right? So a stressor, I have to go for a doctor's appointment, or I have to move, or I'm going to get a new job. For heterosexual, cisgender people, those could just be stressors because yeah, I can go do that. But for people outside of that norm, for people within the queer community, because the world isn't created for you, those stressors become trauma wounds. Okay. So this means we're always in survival. Okay? When we're dealing with shame, when we're dealing with trying to navigate a world not created for us, and then we're dealing with sexualized violence and the trauma of that, we're living in a state of survival, right? Our sympathetic nervous system, that's fight, flight, is turned on. we're always being flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, and there's like 36 other stress hormones that we're being flooded with, right? And that constant state of survival impacts our health, right? Causes inflammation and makes us sick, makes it more difficult for us to function because we lose access to our logic, our executive function, when we're always in survival mode. And this makes us more vulnerable. Okay. So here are some citations for section 2. All right. The very first one, health-related shame. How shame affects our health. Right? And even just the shame of thinking, I can't go and access healthcare. I can't go and access law enforcement, right? That second one, the promoting LGBT health through inclusive policy development, that's actually a seniors care home, if I remember correctly, which is really interesting about how the effects of this lifelong living in survival, living in places that aren't made for queer people, affects our health and affects the way that we engage with the health system. And then the third one is self-explanatory. And then, of course, the fourth one is just showing that when we become vulnerable to a lot of things, right? We end up with living in places because we're housing insecure, and so we accept housing that isn't appropriate, or we accept help from people who aren't helpful. We don't eat well. We don't take care of ourselves because we're in survival.